Well, you tell me, I don't, what's best?
We'll do the gallery modes or
Okay.
speaker mode. You'll see them when they unmute.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you all very much for being here. This is such an important topic, and I'm glad that we're discussing it. We have our ranking member, Mr. Larson from the Northwest, and Mr. Stanton is here in and out, and then we have some of the experts here to talk to us about the issue of extreme heat. I'll just make a few comments for the record. I'm not telling y'all anything. You're the experts who need to tell us, but I think some of these things are worth pointing out. You know, we are in Las Vegas. We had 117 degrees, Tracy knows, for a number of days this summer, and everywhere across the country it was the hottest summer on record. 175 million people were under excessive heat advisories across the country just in the month of July. And the impacts of heat, we know, some are very obvious. The drier conditions lead to wildfires, which generate smoke that's not healthy and burn out of control, destroying property and lives. And in the West, we also know heat has an impact on water. You see it just in the bathtub rings at Lake Mead because of the Colorado River. As a result of the rising temperatures, Lake Mead loses 600,000 acre-feet of water a year due to evaporation. So that gives you some kind of idea of the impact on water. So that means less water for farmers, less water for hydroelectric power, for drinking, and for recreation. We also know that heat kills not just dogs left in cars, but it kills more people annually than hurricanes and tornadoes put together. And I doubt if many people realize that because they don't hear those statistics as much as they do the statistics from storms. Emergency room visits are increasing considerably because of heat exposure, and heat-related deaths are up 95% since 2010. In Nevada, Arizona, and California, we've seen those heat-related hospitalizations rise 50% higher than just in the last couple of years. We also know that minorities and low-income communities are more impacted than others because they tend to be in heat islands in our urban areas. Now, the White House has taken a number of steps recently to address heat and protect communities, and I really appreciate that. It's the White House Interagency Working Group on Extreme Heat, and that's to make investments in strengthening the power grid against heat. And they've also expanded the use of some FEMA programs like BRIC to include infrastructure resilience against extreme heat. So we appreciate what the White House is doing, but I think that Congress can do more too. Now, we've got the experts here. The purpose of this roundtable is to hear maybe what you're doing, what some of the problems are that you're facing, and maybe how Congress can respond to it, either through FEMA or other mechanisms in our infrastructure and Transportation Committee. As I said, we've got the experts here, so if we can go around the room and introduce ourselves, we'll start with the people here, and then we'll go to those of you who are tuned in, and we urge you to press the talk button, and then you'll appear on our screen. So thank you very much. Tracy, you want to start?
Good morning. My name is Tracy Bauer. I'm the Director of External Affairs with the Desert Research Institute. DRI is part of the Nevada System of Higher Education. We have about 500 scientists who are focused on environmental research, both in Nevada and around the world. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Juanita Constable with the Natural Resources Defense Council based here in DC. I work as a senior climate and health advocate.
Could you pull that microphone, just pull it right up to your face?
Right. Is this better? Thanks. Should I start again or? Perfect. I work as a senior climate and health advocate, and in that role, I work with partners to advance federal and state programs that will reduce the preventable health harms of heat, including death and morbidity. Thank you.
Other introductions?
Good morning. I don't know can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Rod Nirenberg, Mayor of the City of San Antonio. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you. And you're representing also the League of Cities?
Yes, ma'am. Proud to do so.
Thank you. Ms. Miller? Or Mr. Miller? Yes. Robbie Miller, you want to introduce yourself? Okay, I guess you're, all right. Well, Ms. Levering?
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Levering. I'm the emergency manager for the city of Las Vegas, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me join your panel today.
Well, thank you. You've given us some good information in the past. This is going to be an informal discussion. We'll start off with a few questions, but before we do that, I'd like to ask Mr. Larson if he wants to make a statement, and then Mr. Stanton.
Yeah, thank you, Ranking Member Titus, for organizing this roundtable on examining the impacts of extreme heat and events. So I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion on the realities that communities are facing as they experience seemingly unrelenting heat waves. Climate change is fueling unprecedented temperature events around the country. NASA declared this July the hottest month on record. And my home state of Washington is not immune. We are experiencing record-breaking temperatures as well. In the summer of 2021, an unprecedented heat wave in the Pacific Northwest contributed to the deaths of 159 people. That's just Washington State. With a certain amount of irony, several months later, it was followed by 3 separate atmospheric river events in November, sort of the opposite of what happened. Although they followed so closely one after the other, it seemed like one long month of unprecedented rains. And wildfires in 2022 in my state, we responded to 620 plus or minus wildfires. And to date, in 2023 in Washington State, our state DNR has responded to double that. The weather is changing, and those changes in weather come in different forms, including extreme heat. So we on the Transportation Committee have the opportunity to do something about this growing issue because our jurisdiction on the committee includes emergency management and the oversight of FEMA. So I look forward to discussing and hearing how local, state, and federal emergency managers play a role in extreme heat preparedness and response. However, it's only one piece of the puzzle. Since extreme heat impacts all sectors of society, this problem will require a whole of government response. And I want to thank our participants ahead of time today for your time. Your experience and expertise are invaluable to this discussion, and I hope this is just the beginning of our efforts to adapt, not just to adapt the impacts of extreme heat to save lives and ensure public safety, but to help our government response adapt as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stanton?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Titus, for convening this important discussion today. Thank you to each of our panelists for participating. I think it's going to be a very important discussion. Arizona, of course, is no stranger to extreme heat, and what we're seeing, especially this past summer, is truly unprecedented. Temperatures staying incredibly high on a sustained basis, which is new. Phoenix had a temperature of 110 degrees or hotter every single day from June 30th to July 30th, a record 31 days in a row. And the high temperature soared to 115 degrees and above for 17 days in July, and most 115-degree days ever recorded in the single year. Now, that's a real problem. But what's equally as much of a problem, if not worse, is the fact that temperatures at night were not cooling off sufficiently. And that has created such a dangerous situation for our most vulnerable populations. In fact, we experienced a record warm low temperature of 97 degrees in July. So this is something that we're going to have to adapt to. We have to understand that the climate crisis is making it so that situations that were fairly mundane previously can quickly evolve into something quite dangerous. I'm looking forward to asking questions. The nature of my questions are going to be, what should the role of FEMA be in helping cities and communities dealing with extreme heat? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we could start there and ask all of you, those of you who can weigh in, just how much you're considering extreme heat through any plans that you make, and how much you anticipate that this will cost, because FEMA tends to put the cost of extreme heat incidences lower than it does tornadoes or floods or something. So could you just give us a sense of where you all are in addressing extreme heat briefly before we kind of break it down into pieces? Tracy?
So Desert Research Institute has a focus, again, on environmental research. So our scientists have done a number of studies that have looked at the impacts of extreme heat on communities. And we know that it's having an increasing impact on communities throughout the desert Southwest, but also in areas like the Pacific Northwest that have seen significantly higher temperatures than normal, that are considered normal for that region. Communities, again, accustomed to heat like the desert Southwest are seeing hotter temperatures and, again, those hotter overnight temperatures because of the urban heat island effect. But even communities like Reno, Nevada, which you wouldn't normally think about seeing the impact of extreme heat, Reno is considered the fastest warming city in the country. So communities that have traditionally not been a part of the heat discussion are increasingly feeling the impacts. Las Vegas, which we know has been a city that has experienced the impacts of extreme heat for a long time, are also seeing the hotter overnight temperatures because of the built environment. While we expect that, we are also seeing that communities, even within Las Vegas, that don't have air conditioning or can't afford to run air conditioning are feeling the effects of extreme heat. People who work indoors are often considered immune to the impacts of extreme heat, but we're seeing that employees who work in hot commercial kitchens, for example, or employees who work in dry cleaning facilities are exposed to extreme heat conditions even indoors throughout the day. We're seeing the impacts based on the studies that our scientists have done that show that women in particular are experiencing the health impacts of extreme heat in greater quantities than men. We also, in one of our recent studies, found that people who work outdoors for a longer period of time, used to think I grew up in Las Vegas, and I thought that I had been accustomed to the heat. But their studies actually found that the longer someone works outdoors in the heat, the greater the potential for health impacts. And that is, I think, needing additional study because they don't know if that is because somebody who works outdoors for a long period of time doesn't take adequate precautions because they think that they've adjusted to the heat, or if there's a cumulative health impact that arises from working in the heat for a long period of time.
Thank you so much. So Tracy actually set up my remarks really well because one of the policy priorities, policy priorities for NRDC when it comes to heat is protecting workers. We see this as an equity issue, as an economic issue. It's an issue that will affect our ability to build the clean energy economy we need to fight climate change in the first place. In fact, some researchers believe that extreme heat and its effect on workers and worker productivity will be one of the major contributors to the overall economic costs of climate change. So it's of grave concern for us. And transportation and infrastructure workers are among the most vulnerable. We saw all the stories about UPS this summer, people fainting on doorsteps, going to the hospital with kidney disease, which is simply boggling when we know how to prevent the health harms of heat. And I actually really appreciate y'all sharing your stories because I know behind each one of those, there's real people and real families being affected. Beyond the direct health impacts on workers, we're actually pretty worried about the effect of heat on the ability of FEMA to deliver its mission, and not just FEMA, but other emergency responders. So, for example, extreme heat actually has been shown to increase violence rates, crime rates, overall emergency response calls in communities, which puts an additional burden on responders. And there's a really intriguing study that suggests that heat may actually increase workplace discrimination and harassment. And the GAO reported in 2022 on a 2019 survey that over a quarter of FEMA employees felt that they'd experienced workplace harassment and discrimination. So there's a burnout issue here that I think is being currently unaddressed. What's that?
Good morning.
No pun intended. I have lots of heat puns.
Mayor, would you share with us
Good morning.
what you're doing in your city to make this part of your plans for the future and how to address extreme heat?
Yeah, well, good morning. And first, thank you to members Larson, Titus, and Stanton for having us and the members of the panel here. Very honored to be here in representation of the city of San Antonio, but also thousands of cities through the National League of Cities. First, I just characterize our investments in probably three categories. One is what we're doing with the immediate response, and a lot of that is education and data processing, data analysis to let people know, number one, the impacts of the heat, how many folks are being threatened by it. We saw an immediate 50% increase in our heat exposure, heat illness, emergency related calls in San Antonio just this year after setting major records last year. So we've been spending a tremendous amount of time making sure people know the signs of heat illness, ensuring that they have resources available to them to combat that, and encouraging people to stay out of heat as necessary. I would also say that in San Antonio, we have opened, we've had, first of all, 107 days in a row, actually 108 as of yesterday, of 90-degree plus days, very little rain. And of course, we set new records, broke through records again of 100+ degree days here in the town as well. We've opened 80 cooling centers around town to ensure people have access to cool places to go to get out of the heat. We've been providing water and other assistance to folks who are in most vulnerable conditions. And then, of course, going upstream, what we can do to prevent. We have started a resiliency fund in the city of San Antonio of $10 million, roughly $10 million a year that's set aside from our general fund to go towards innovative projects and pilot projects to do things like combat the urban heat island effect, so we can begin to spend a considerable amount of our capital fund leveraged against federal resources to do things in a scaled up way. Cool pavement, cooling shelters, other ways that we can build resilient infrastructure in our city. Finally, I'd say on systems approach, transformation of our transportation system to lower emissions, as well as transition of our power generation portfolio. San Antonio is going to end the use of coal 40 years early, ahead of schedule, made possible, of course, by the fact that the Biden administration and those members of Congress supporting legislation like the IRA are allowing us to scale up change faster in response to climate change. I think the big message here is that it's real, it's happening. We're having immediate life-threatening impacts in our communities, and we need to respond from a policy level. We need to respond immediately, and we need to go upstream from the challenge to make sure that we're building our cities in a more resilient and equitable manner.
Thank you. Ms. Levering, would you add to that from Las Vegas, both in terms of what you're doing, but also how you're educating the public? The mayor talked about the need to educate the public. What's Las Vegas doing for that?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for having me here today. Thank you. At the local level for emergency management, one of our biggest responsibilities is educating the community about the hazards that face our community. Extreme heat has always been part of our education portfolio under the guise of extreme heat or extreme weather events. But heat takes kind of a back seat to that because we do have other extreme weather events, as we've seen this summer with some of our monsoon and tail ends of hurricanes coming to Nevada. So in the city of Las Vegas, one of our core responsibilities in emergency management is the education of the population through the Community Emergency Response Team program. We receive significant funding from FEMA through the Department of Homeland Security for the purpose of that education and training program to keep people understanding what the hazards are, how to be prepared for them on an individual and family basis, and having other plans in place, communications plans, emergency kits, considerations for pets, for elderly, for young people in the home, or people with special needs. And although we get those funds for the outreach and the education component of it, it's really difficult to get people's attention in our community where there's a lot of distractions. People don't want to think about the bad things that can happen to them. And very often emergencies are at the very far back of their minds. And so then when we get caught off guard, surprised with the flood like we haven't seen in a long time, it brings everybody back to center, reminding them that we need to do a better job of being prepared. The call to action is more challenging. It's you can lead the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink, so to speak. So educating people, making them aware, doesn't always translate into action on their part. And even though we try to remind people that we don't have enough resources response-wise to respond to the entire valley at once, all right, we're not designed, it's not a sustainable model to be designed to respond to everybody at the same time. People still seem to think that there's a cavalry out there that's going to arrive in the nick of time every time. We've been lucky that in many cases we do provide those services, but we're going to be outpaced eventually as these emergencies continue to hit us with longer seasons of heat, stronger seasons of heat, and a lack of our ability to adapt to those changes and those severe threats in our community.
Thank you. We see things that go from planting trees to signs and information, don't leave children or dogs in locked cars, covered bus stops, even little things like that can make a difference in certain neighborhoods. Mr. Miller, you want to talk about what NACO is doing and how counties are trying to be part of
Yes,
this
ma'am.
government approach?
Yes, ma'am. Can y'all hear me now? Do y'all finally have me? Okay, great. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. And I do represent NACO, counties, the National Association of Counties, and specifically Louisiana parishes. So, for the most part, the country is rural. Much of the country is rural. So a lot of in Louisiana mimics the country. Obviously, it's been very hot in Louisiana and throughout, as y'all indicated. A little different topic maybe is that we have experienced wildfires that we don't normally have to deal with because of the extreme heat and then combined drought. Our fields and even our farmers were struggling to irrigate their farms because their canals that they usually collect water in were all dry. And then on fighting the wildfires were thankfully our state natural resources department, agriculture department has an incredible team that fights the fires with their bulldozers and so forth, which was something new. Obviously, we're very experienced with dealing with floods and hurricanes and how to handle those and respond. I think we think that a little different approach, like I said, than some of the things y'all talked about is during these responses, maybe it's not a national disaster, but if FEMA were engaged a little bit more, those resources would have been easier, a little more relief on the local volunteer firefighters, the volunteer Department of Ag the workers and the volunteers that work with the Department of Ag who fight those fires. That might be a little easier to pull some of the resources from FEMA. But as far as every day, we've had extreme heat like everyone else. We haven't, from what I can understand, we in Louisiana especially, but maybe across the country too, didn't have the demand on first responders as some of you have experienced. Maybe it's because we in Louisiana deal with it a little bit more. And we do have a lot of rural, like I said, a lot of tree cover, a lot of opportunity to be in the water normally and be in the shade. So the extreme heat, I think, from our perspective, is much more involved in when there's an event caused by the heat. How do we call upon the resources of FEMA?
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you want to?
Yeah, as a former local elected official, I guess I want to focus on the local elected officials here. Mayor Nierenberg, good to see you again. I wanted to know if you have, same for Parish President Miller, talking about the infrastructure impacts, and are you doing any planning ahead, both for your road system, bridge system, your transit system, as you're thinking ahead 5 years from now? And then, first off, second is about the employees that work for the city and the parish respectively, especially those, say, in public works who have to be outside, or your parks department folks who have to be outside. What do you hear from them, and what does that mean for the changes you may need to be thinking about as a city and as a parish to support your workers? We'll start with Mayor Nierenberg.
No, thank you very much, Congressman Larson, and great to see you as well. And I wanted to pick right where you just started from Robbie's comments. And just to emphasize, this is a global issue, but it's the local governments, local communities that are really having to respond to this. And we are responding, I think, effectively simply because we have federal partnership. You talked about the infrastructure needed to make change here, and specifically here in San Antonio, we've had, and not unlike many other cities within the National League of Cities network, we have challenges with respect to inequitable investments in the history and the challenges that presents to the community with respect to vulnerable communities. We do not have a mass transit system in San Antonio, the 7th largest city in the United States. We finally have one underway, being built. It will come online the same time we are ending the use of coal in 2028. And that is made possible because of the Biden administration and the Infrastructure Act, the infrastructure law. So that work is very significant in terms of the transformation to allow us to meet this challenge of resiliency, but obviously would not happen unless there was federal partnership. Similarly, we're working towards a transition in power. As I mentioned, we have a lot of work underway with tree canopy, with direct pay from the IRA benefit, and all of that again is in partnership with the administration, with the legislation that Congress has passed. So I will tell you that local communities stand ready to do the policy work as well. In San Antonio, for instance, we changed our code last year to require level EV2 chargers in all new home construction, as well as solar readiness for all roofs. So we're doing the work necessary. We're taking on the political challenges, but the resources are being made possible to accomplish this through partnership with the federal government. Now, with respect to workers, this is a big area of concern for us, and one that, frankly, we are thrilled to see the backstop with OSHA. We'd like to see a little bit more rulemaking. Obviously, with extreme heat and very little rain and no relief, even in the nighttime, we're concerned for our workers. So we applaud the announcement recently by President Biden on OSHA rules. In San Antonio, we just passed an ordinance that requires all local contractors who are under city contract to provide heat breaks for workers. Came with a degree of controversy, obviously. In fact, our state legislature, which is also not unlike many state legislatures throughout the country now, is trying to prevent local governments from passing those kinds of ordinances. And we're in a lawsuit right now with the state government to trying to prevent those kinds of ordinances. And so we need help with regard to protecting democracy in that regard, but the work is underway to protect our workers, to build the infrastructure, and we're going to continue to do it. And we're so glad and thrilled by the work that you all are doing.
Thanks. Parish President Miller, chat
Sure.
a little bit about the impact on your actual infrastructure and then as your workers as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman. On the workers side, every year I've been in office 8 years, almost 8 years now, and every year since we've been in office, whenever it gets hot, and this year obviously being hotter than the past, we transition our work times, our start time and finish time to earlier in the day, so start in the morning. Some of our folks, and then we've always had the water breaks that we make sure that their hydration is on their vehicles, the ones that are working outside every day, on their tractors, on their trucks, to make sure that they always have either water and or Gatorade or Powerade, one of the drinks, whichever one they want. We have, when they come back in to the work, to our to the shops, they have popsicles and more water and more hydration and revitalization type drinks going on, and we make sure it's all there. I think that Mayor, not to counter you, but we set the example and some of our businesses are following. So I don't know if we necessarily have to have regulation for it or ordinances for it, but We've been setting the standard, and most of them are following, and we see it a lot. Although in Louisiana and probably a lot of the rural other parts of the country, being that I represent NACO, you'll just see that local government has to do those things to keep our employees, because we don't get to compete as well with compensation, so we have to compete with other ways of doing it. And so we do that by better work conditions and taking better care of what we believe, taking better care of our folks. From an infrastructure standpoint, we haven't gotten to the point I love the ideas of more trees and so forth along the roadways, but at the same time, whenever most of our rural roadways are people drive in excessive speed of what they should be, having trees closer to the roads, not necessarily the safest thing to do. I am interested, somebody spoke of the cool, I guess, concrete, asphalt, whatever. I am interested to know about that, because that could be something that would be interesting for us to look at from a county standpoint.
Thank you.
I like that idea of popsicles. That sounds pretty good. Y'all want to weigh in?
Thank you. So DRI has recently convened the Southern Nevada Heat Resilience Lab, which is really designed to bring together agencies throughout Southern Nevada who are responding to heat in some fashion. I think one of the challenges that we've realized is that no one agency owns the heat response. And so whether you're at a city, a county, a social service agency, or the health district, they all have a hand in the response. But there's been no real sort of centralized conversation around how to improve the response in Southern Nevada. So DRI recently received a grant to bring together those agencies to start the conversation about what each of them are doing in response to heat and how a coordinated regional response might improve the response. And so it's not a top-down, it's not our scientists telling these agencies what to do, but really convening all of them together to figure out what's working in the different pockets that they're responsible for responding to. And so we're hopeful that that will create, again, a better coordinated response that will increase the resources that are available to vulnerable populations. And I think the built environment is one of the things that we've heard people touch on, and especially in Southern Nevada. You know, we have a great community response, and Carolyn can talk to like the opening of cooling centers and things like that. But when you have the urban heat island effect, one, it's going to be hotter later in the day, which we've heard about earlier in this conversation. But it also makes it difficult for people to access those cooling centers. So if you have a cooling center that's a few miles away and you have to wait in the hot desert sun for transit to be able to get there because you're a transit-dependent individual, that built environment is exacerbating the heat problem that already exists. So again, we're hoping that through this Southern Nevada Heat Resilience Lab that we can create some solutions to those challenges that people are finding when trying to access services.
A problem at the federal level, too. Who's going to take the responsibility? Is it just FEMA? Is it Health and Human Services? Where do we put it when it's something we need to think about? Ms. Constable, then Mr. Stanton.
I'm so happy you raised the governance issue, because I was just about to talk about that. So one of the things that we think Congress can do right away is to strengthen the role of the National Integrated Heat Health Information System that has been doing great work but doesn't have its own formal place in federal law or its own source of funding. And the Preventing Heat Illness and Deaths Act, which Ranking Member, I know you're a co-sponsor of, that would actually set up a rotating co-chair system where agencies would take turns running NIHIS over, I think it's 5-year increments. I think it's critical to keep keep heat in a multi-jurisdictional frame rather than trying to shoehorn it in emergency management or simply public health. It's an everything problem. It's a road, grid infrastructure, health problem, and one agency alone can't really take the responsibility. One last thing, I'd love to see the Department of Transportation formally join NIHIS. I know there's been conversations and a little more collaboration with NIHIS and the DOT folks. For a lot of the reasons you raised, taking advantage of the NIHIS partnerships and research base would help DOT improve its own research, its own planning, and rulemaking processes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor Titus. Recently, there have been attempts by members of Congress to provide clarity that extreme heat can be a basis upon FEMA to come into the community and provide support. The FEMA administrator was in front of our committee just a couple of days ago. I asked that question. She felt that FEMA already has the authority to provide support for communities in extreme heat and did not need additional legislative authority. That being said, it is a little bit of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole about whether or not extreme heat can be considered for a disaster declaration. Ranking Member Larson mentioned the number of deaths, huge number of deaths heat-related in his area. I'm sure Congresswoman Titus and myself, at the end of this summer, when our communities finally determine the number of heat-related deaths, it's going to be a shocking number. Certainly at a level that would be appropriate for a disaster declaration, but of course it's not a single incident. Extreme heat is kind of a slow motion natural disaster. Part of the issue also is that we have not received calls from governors from the Desert Southwest area, have not made requests for the president for a disaster declaration. Since there have only been 3 heat-related disaster declaration requests that have been sent to the president. All of those were submitted before the year 2000. So in recent times, there has actually not been a request by a governor for a disaster declaration. This is really a question for any of our panelists. Why do you think states have refrained from submitting heat-related disaster declaration requests? And then would additional guidance from FEMA regarding what extreme heat events might qualify for federal disaster assistance, would guidance inspire states to submit heat-related declaration requests?
Congressman Stanton, if I may answer that question. First of all, I want to thank one of my colleagues, Mayor Gallego, for elevating this issue with the Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, but we certainly would support additional authorities for FEMA on issuing a heat-related disaster. One of the challenges in Texas is the lack of uniformity of data and reporting with respect to heat-related illness and deaths. So that kind of guidance from the federal level to local communities directly on data reporting would be enormously helpful for us to elevate the issue within our local communities and provide guidance on mitigation efforts in that manner. So fully supportive of that, and we would be helpful with respect to elevating that issue in our local community.
Mayor, that's very helpful. Any other
Ms.
witnesses?
Lavery? Yeah, I was just going to see if Ms. Lavery wanted to add to that.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the challenges FEMA faces when participating in discussions regarding responses and consequence management to a heat event is that precedence in FEMA is centered around a handful of objectives. One is that the incident needs to have a definitive beginning and end time, and one singular heat event is very difficult to determine when it started, when it ended, or whether it was multiple back-to-back heat events, right? It's really easy to say when the hurricane started and when the hurricane ended. And FEMA's responses center around specific events. And even when one community gets hit more than once, back-to-back succession, FEMA parses out its recovery funds based on, was it this event or was it the one following that event? Was it wind damage or was it flood damage? And I'm sure our friends in Louisiana can talk a whole lot more about how that affects their capabilities when they have back-to-back hurricanes. Defining when a heat event starts and when it ends and determining what damage it caused in that period of time. We don't have a lot of precedent for it, and we don't have a lot of ways to document it in the same way that we do for other hazards. Similar to drought. Drought is one of those slow-moving, long-lasting, high-impact events that it happens so slowly and lasts so long that we fail to sometimes recognize the emergent nature of it. And that's the same problem with heat. And so I think, yes, FEMA stands ready to respond and to assist, but for us at the local level, it's hard to be able to identify for them. And that's hard for the state then to also, right? The state has to make that request on the local government's behalf. But they don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox to be able to identify, address, and send that data that FEMA requires in order to elevate the response to something more federal.
Thank you.
Tracy, are y'all doing any research that would help with this definition or this timing that would make it?
I'm not aware of any research that is specific to sort of FEMA's response, but I think what Carolyn spoke to was sort of the invisible nature of the heat issue. It isn't like a hurricane that you see on radar sort of barreling towards, a community. The impacts are not as visible perhaps as, flooding or earthquake damage. And so I think that sort of invisible nature of it, and as she spoke to, the long duration of it, makes the response a lot more challenging to define in terms of what the needs are while you're in it, and then what the recovery looks like after the fact as well. But I do think that sort of drives the discussion on the built environment and maybe how we can prevent the impacts of heat. We heard a little bit about sort of the cooling, cooling surfaces. DRI is doing some research that looks at the built environment and how, rooftop brightening can help to reflect some of the heat, how you can use different building materials. And also looking at landscapes. Southern Nevada has done a terrific job of conserving water through the landscape rebate program that encourages people to take out grass and put in water-efficient landscaping. The Southern Nevada Water Authority has had requirements in place that you can't just take out that grass and put in rock, because that has a heating, impact on the environment. Our scientists have done some research that found that combination, right, of trees and shrubs in those landscape conversions help to mitigate that trade-off, because there is a trade-off. When you take out grass, grass has a cooling effect on the environment. When you put in rock or other hard materials, you're going to heat that environment. So the right kinds of plants, the right kinds of shade trees, balance that water efficiency requirement with, again, trying to keep the built environment cool. And so we're doing research in that area, looking at how we can create a better built environment to help prevent extreme heat from having such an impact on our community.
Might I ask, can I step in?
Please do.
Okay. On the FEMA response, there's no doubt that, hurricanes, floods are easy to identify, start and finish. The heat was different than that, but in a bigger process from FEMA, what we've been discussing is part of the reason I think the cost of FEMA is accept to the government is so high through FEMA back to the local governments is that we, as several of you said, that we, local government, are the, we're the closest to the folks. We're the ones who actually touch and feel and provide the services to the people who need it the most. Is the red tape that it takes to be able to get reimbursed. One, to identify that there's a reimbursement. Two, then to actually legitimately get the reimbursement back to us. There's excessive cost to do that. And I'll give you one quick example, and there's plenty throughout Louisiana. We literally, to get reimbursed for one of our storm after Ida, we had our EOC activated. People were working 24 hours a day. We fed breakfast to a crew. One of the questions that came back was, you say there were 30 people in the EOC. Why did you buy 60 biscuits? That's a factual question. Same thing happens in another parish about some other food products, meals for the folks. But if FEMA could come up with a plan to evaluate, and they quickly do it now, we already do it, this event is going to cost $50 million, $100 million, $1 billion, whatever it is, that if they would just front 50% of the money to the parish, to the county, to just go to work and do it, we'd still have to justify it, on the back end. That would save tons of money and get us responding quicker. If you start doing that and save money, then let us be the determining factor. We hear Congress and Senate all the time talk about the locals know what's really going on. Well, trust us when we say we need some assistance for this. And the requests will be a lot lower than what will be on the backside of it if we get to ask in the front, because we get to handle it much quicker up front. just a little thought about how FEMA actually operates. It'd be nice to see them actually ask us more.
I appreciate that. We hear that for other disasters as well as heat. Often
Right.
that's a kind of a critique of how FEMA operates. We've talked about deaths and impacts on health. What about wellness checks with the elderly? We know this is going to be, this is a problem. Does anybody have wellness checks on the elderly, or how do you get the information to them for how to deal with this? I don't know, you'll start.
So one thing I would point to is the success of programs like Be a Buddy in New York
Oh, Be a
City,
Buddy.
or other social cohesion programs where there are volunteers being trained to go out and do these wellness checks of their older neighbors or disabled neighbors. Those kinds of social programs often get kind of left out of the conversation of heat because it's not a thing we can build with concrete, but it's absolutely critical, especially as we find ourselves in a loneliness epidemic and have an aging population that's more and more vulnerable to heat.
We've lost the mayor. He had to go to a council meeting. Anybody else want to weigh in on, are there any programs in Las Vegas that do this sort of thing, Ms. Levering?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit more piecemeal than that. Wellness checks typically fall under our social organizations, social services type organizations or elder care organizations. But even through the pandemic, we learned that assistance to people who are homebound needs special care. And that would certainly be something that would be worthwhile for us to build upon, especially with our developing of volunteers. To develop our volunteers to be able to be workforce multipliers for us, to be able to check on folks in communities, especially if they've registered themselves as needing special assistance in an emergency. Those are definitely opportunities that we could pursue if we had the funding for it.
Anybody else?
I believe from most of our counties throughout the country, again, being rural, especially in Louisiana, I think that it is more or less piecemeal, like was said just now. Most of us have some type of social media going on with education pieces and encouraging. And then we have volunteer groups who activate in the bigger disasters. And again, back to being heat, not being the here it is, here it starts and here it ends. We all know. So basically just most of us are pushing through social media to check on your neighbors, make sure they're taken care of. But if there was a program that we all had a messaging for, it'd be nice. I think it'd be a good help.
What about animal safety during extreme heat? Do you put out information on that as well, or how do you deal with that?
Yes, ma'am. And our parish actually has animal control, animal shelter. And our shelter, thankfully, is for the most part climate controlled, not 100% AC, but has nice ventilation and some AC areas. But we do our agents who are out on the road are being attentive and reminding folks not to leave them outside, not to keep them in the sun, make sure there's shade, water, and so forth, especially for the outside pets that they take care of. It's another social media advocacy out there, not an official program, but just basically being a good citizen.
Thank you, Ms. Levering.
We don't have any data on large animals. We do have a significantly sized, equine horse community in the Las Vegas area. Some people might be surprised to hear that. We don't have a lot of data on those animals, but we do see increases in our shelters for surrender of animals when people can't care for them any longer. And the interdependency we have on the heat grid and our water system and everything else could very well affect many thousands of animals if we were to suffer any kind of loss of power for any extended period of time. We don't have a lot in the way of contingency plans for 1,000 cats and dogs and chickens and hamsters and roosters that might be in the shelter on any given day. So that is a significant issue for us. We've been working on that at the state level as well, on just how to handle pets and service animals in any other kind of traditional emergency sense, but for a long-term extended power outage that would prevent us from being able to keep animals in those facilities, that definitely would be an emergency for us to have to handle.
Well, thank you. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but it's been very valuable. I would ask you if y'all have any specific recommendations that you think we, as member of Congress, can do, whether it's putting forward something about FEMA, encouraging regulations to move forward, rulemaking, anything like that. Could I ask you to submit that to us? Because we don't want this to be a one-off. We want this to really turn into some action and some results. I appreciate everything y'all are doing at the local level and research and organizations that are addressing this, because I do believe it's going to become increasingly a crisis situation. And that business about how to define it, when it starts and when it stops, so that FEMA can better address it and respond to it, I think is a real critical point that y'all made. So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll look forward to getting that information from you so we can move forward. And we'll continue to rely on your expertise and wise counsel as we do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.